Welcome back to Night School, literally in the case of Wes right now. Today we're going to talk about the Russian classic by the national novelist, as it were, at least according to the introducer to the Oxford Classic translation of Onegin, I guess, as the audible uh, um, auditor says, adapter of the prose into voice
Hmm.
says. So I was right with Babcock last week, Wes, to be conscientious about my pronunciation. And apparently, Onegin is not right. It's more like with an Inya, Onegin,
Hmm. Let the
which
record show.
I
Okay.
may still be wrong. So here's my big AI piece right here. Since we don't know Russian, even if we listen to multiple translations, we can have versions we like more, but we can't judge that against the actual primary source. Same problem with
Hmm.
AI. Unless you read the primary sources, you can't see what's just straight up wrong. Um,
Ah.
and so all of a sudden, it's still very valuable to do one's own work. And even if one's using AI to make something faster or to do something quickly, then one can still be accurate because it can't necessarily be so.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and I just wanted to add that for, I guess, apparently no reason. Um, but
That's kind of a theme with these. Yeah, no, and we should mention that Babcock is not with us tonight because he's busy doing real world things like soccer tournaments or something. And I think if he had shown up, it would have been fine without reading this poem, novel in verse, whatever you want to call it. Uh, it's still possible to talk about it in a weird way because it has this kind of status, right, within literature. Um, it's got this massive influence, so we can obviously do more with the poem once we have read it, right? That's your kind of real digging into the material. But there is this other layer of, you know, the way that maybe call it like the sociological or something, right? Like the way that this object exists in the world is kind of aside from whatever interpretation you might have of the thing itself. And so I obviously I think there's a lot more value in the former, um, but other people might disagree. Maybe even most people actually. So yeah, it's and I would say I think that there's a ton of value in showing up to seminar not having done the reading. Uh, I know this for a fact because I'm guilty of it. I've done it before, and I know that a lot of students, when I would, have to teach, at the Great Heart schools or whatever, a lot of the students would show up and they'd have sort of kind of read, but as Nabokov says, if you haven't reread, you haven't really read, and so there's, but there's still a ton of value in just showing up, right, and just like being willing to yeah, ask questions, uh, be unsure, be, contributing just your presence and your voice. And so, yeah, it's a great loss to not have Babcock with us, but we're gonna try to get through this. Try to, the classic mode of night school tonight, just the two of us.
hopefully he is one of the listeners of this episode. And I do hope also that some of the listeners know that I will be in the comments and answering any questions they have. I recently have returned some of my old work that had some comments and sometimes some critical comments. And I
Hmm.
spent some time this week responding to those. And I think I gave good, intelligent responses to these individuals, and I hope that they feel, and I hope that other listeners uh, uh, appreciate getting those additional access to those additional insights too. So that is a maybe an evocation, but definitely an invitation to engage with us because I at least will engage with you. And I can always let
Cool.
if somebody has a question for Wes, I can always let Wes know. And because I get the notifications on the YouTube channel, but you can also engage with Wes through Video Game Academy.
There you go. Yeah, the Discord. It's always there.
Yeah. So Wes, I appreciate, yeah, so I appreciate both those perspectives, and I think they're very teacherly and they're very welcoming. And I love that, especially being not that sort of teacher in particular. I think I am welcoming, but not as welcoming as you are. But so something and and I do think talking about the status of a work and what it has become beyond the actual works in its pay or beyond the actual words in its pages is something worth talking about and is what I would also add most people have to resort to talking about because they are unfortunate victims of the commonplace. The classic is a book that everybody knows but nobody has read.
Mhm.
But in this case, we have done the reading and we both read the whole book, but we're going to talk about the first four chapters because even though we're not experts on this, and these are sort of first time reads, and so this is like spring training of the intellect. We do still try to give it the old college try, but I did, and I do hope Babcock is listening and really like kicks something and frustration at not being able to answer this on the fly. So maybe he'll get in the comments too. But I had I what I would consider the St. John's questions that were pretty particularly oriented towards Babcock, and I was looking forward to him telling me that they were sort of wrongly framed, and actually I was like a character in Nabokov's novels by asking something and something interesting like that. But why does Nabokov love Pushkin and Eugene Onegin?
Mm.
Um, and how is this work supposed to be like Pale Fire? And in what ways is this work modernist? Obviously, it is like 18th century. There's this sort of Byron-esque Don Juan in it.
Mm.
But it's in this poetic style as well. And it does seem to be a little bit self-conscious. Um, Also, very much flaunts its influences. Good Latin poetry like Virgil, but don't know the difference between dactyls and anapests, like our Adam Smith, if we're Eugene Onegin. Certain female characters like Clarissa by Richardson. Uh,
Mhm.
that's a monster of a tome, by the way. I think it's the largest, sometimes called the largest novel in English literature. It is. I have one. It's very big somewhere. Um, but um, but also knowledge of French. And then there's discussion of can you even express love in Russian? And so we see this constant theme that we see in, I think, every single Russian author that we read, but particularly in Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, this denigration by the sort of upper class slash middle upper class, the educated, cultured class of the
Yeah.
Russian tongue. Um, and so, yeah, what could you give it the old Babcock try? With
Sure.
uh,
I mean, yeah, I think the connection here is, I mean, we are kind of reading this right now because we're reading a lot of Russian things, and there's obviously an important, I guess, gap in anyone's knowledge who hasn't read this book. If you want to think about Russian literature as a whole, there's that, and more directly, right, we're coming like sort of working our way backwards because of reading uh, the Pale Fire, and that was our attempt to find something more contemporary that still had heart, that still was engaging with important questions of the sort that a Dostoevsky or Tolstoy would also be wrestling with, right? And so we're sort of having this pincer attack here that's led us to a book that's it's very short, right? As much as it is chock full of references and life and all kinds of experience, right? Rich poetry, of course. It is a very slim book, and it could be read, you know, pretty quickly. Um, but clearly, Nabokov was just sort of a master of this text. Like he develops a whole immense commentary upon it. He spends many years, I think, translating or retranslating. Um, he tries to give an account of his theory of translation as a result of doing this, and he writes a couple of very interesting poems, not included in Pale Fire, but that are sort of about the process of translating Pushkin. Um, there's a very famous falling out he has with another literary critic over the approach that he takes, and this critic like calls him out for like making some mistakes, and then he writes this, elaborate, a very like novelistic almost letter in reply, that's like a public letter that's like, no, actually you're wrong. I know what I'm doing, and I did it all very intentionally, and you can see it in my notes if you bothered to look at my notes, right? And so it's just like very catty, very wonderful. Oh, I'm talking, William. I'm on the squares. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, of course Nabokov loves this because it's so cultured, it's so refined, it's so Russian, right, on the one hand, and yet so cosmopolitan. Um, so yeah, clearly very formative for his whole like view of literature and of life, I think. From what I know about. Yeah. So then this character, right? This like you said, yeah, kind of a Don Juan, um, romantic in some ways, but in this very almost buttoned up way. Right, so the very first thing that we get as far as the text goes is supposedly this bit of French from a letter, right? And I think that it's actually just a letter written by Pushkin or something, or maybe he made it up and called it from a letter. But it's basically saying like the nature of this character's pride is such that he affects to be indifferent of his good as well as his bad actions, right?
Mhm.
So he has this kind of defining characteristic, his pride. And I think we could probably see that in a lot of intellectuals, including Nabokov, and a lot of great authors, right? I mean, there's a kind of ambition there. But the peculiar like twist that his character has is that he presents himself as being so cool, so calm, right? So Byron, so like above it all. That he's kind of beyond good and evil, right? He's beyond the good and the bad of his actions. He just is so superior. He's just so, and then it ends with this wonderful little offhand, like maybe it was all imaginary though, right? Maybe it was in his head essentially. And so yeah, we've got the author himself is kind of an insert character, right? Pushkin himself is kind of a character here for certain parts of the poem. It obviously swirls
Though
around
though he claims
Eugene
he's
and
not,
his loves. What's that?
though he claims he's not, he
Yeah,
tries
no, yeah,
against that
he's
claim, which so clearly,
he yeah. There's a metafictional kind of thing going, like playing some kind of game. Um, and then his friend, Lenski, the poet. So the loves of Eugene Onegin, the great one being Tatiana, but others are kind of mentioned. And there's
Olga.
kind of like this ghostly muse that's maybe a real person that Pushkin's alluding to, maybe not, I don't really know, or it's like a poetic muse. Um, so yeah, there's like a weird kind of Hall of Mirrors thing that's happening within this that is very, again, Nabokov. But yeah, so I think it's, as short as it is, there's a lot here, and you can see why, even without knowing the original language, the intricacy of the verse and everything makes this an incredibly artful, incredibly rich text. So,
What's interesting though is that speaking of the original language, one of the original languages I do read, and something interesting about Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and now this Pushkin is that this French is no problem. Particularly one little bit that you left out, you got I thought every line except for the sentiment de superiorité, the sentiment, the feeling of superiority that he has, which reminded me immediately of Raskolnikov and
yeah.
very much of Nabokov as an individual and as a writer, but also of our deluded kingly character from Hail Fire as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to note that this is one of the aspects. You did I think also importantly note the Puetre imaginaire that maybe just imaginary so So whether it's a feeling, what the nature of this feeling is, whether it's related to reality or not, these characters, we're seeing these literary characters who think they're above it all, who think they're better than the common rung of man. And I think if you wanted to, and I'm noting this in your literature and also in discussions we've had, but I think it will please you for me to say that this is very much like the same sort of archetype that Squall Leonhard from Final Fantasy VIII falls under. Like he kind of acts like he's above it all and that he's better than everybody that he's around, and they kind of give him grief for that. Importantly, until he kind of breaks out of his shell. And so part of this literature, which is mostly, I take it, written for young men, though I could see also with the romantic elements there being a female readership too at this time, particularly with the inclusion of the lovely language of French in it, is the development of the personality of the protagonist from a Don Juan who doesn't feel anything, and it kind of suggests that he's very much like a common person today in a major city on dating apps, that he's very kind of mechanical, very Marquis de Sade about what he's going to be doing with ladies. And even though it is this huge important thing that can ruin somebody, and this if it gets out, he's just going to be like, well, I'm disaffected, and so whatever about this. Almost Tale of Genji-esque. Uh,
Hmm.
Amazing how how medieval world literature is uniform in certain respects, but also just world literature. And so, yeah. So all that goes to say is that it is interesting that we can actually engage with this a little bit on the primary level in the language of French, which they were largely speaking, and that is occasionally written here in the text,
Yeah.
in the body of the text.
Yeah, it's really interesting the kind of polyglot way that this is composed because that is part of what the narrator Pushkin, draws attention to the most, really, is like all the times he's using words from other languages. So like the word dandy, he like can't translate into Russian. Um, his quote from Horace that starts one of the chapters or whatever is like a pun on the sound of Horace and the sound of some line that also like sounds kind of like saying "Oh Russia" or something like this. It's like a trilingual pun that he's making there, I think. Um, and then yeah, all the times when he'll like mention a character's name, like Tatiana, when she's first introduced, like this is the first time you're gonna see like a famous book talk about someone named Tatiana. So just like be aware that I'm like breaking new ground here. I'm doing something with the Russian language, and um, and he incorporates, like a certain amount of the folk tradition too. And this is the thing that I do remember from when I first tried to read this a long time ago. I like have a distinct memory of the part where Tatiana is trying to like read the future, right? And I don't think this is in the four chapters. I think it's later. But anyway, she has like a nurse, who's like a peasant woman, I guess, or at least not as refined as her family is. And then there's all the workers in the fields, and they're sort of like singing songs at various points, and that like breaks up the normal structure of the verse. But then there's also this thing about like telling who's gonna fall in love, right? And you can do like a kind of divination practice. And so Tatiana, gets all involved with that. And the thought of that, I think the quality of that and the way that it sort of melds into a surreal like dream sequence with her, that is the one thing I would say from this poem that really kind of stuck with me. That and the duel, like I sort of understood the duel was complicated and that it was happening. Um, but as a kid, like I bounced right off like the ending, where like but again is like contrite and all and it's like very moving. But that did make an impression on me. The thought of like being sort of young and innocent and yet being interested in romantic things, you know. Obviously the duel, because that's like, yeah, heroic, and like that's a very squall versus cipher kind of moment, right? So like, why are we fighting? I don't really know, but let's go at it. So there's elements of this that yes, like feel very uh like relatable in a really weird way. But then there's also elements of it that just feel absolutely foreign, and those elements are things that are heightened. Their foreignness is like drawn attention to and emphasized. So yeah, that's it. I just find that to be a cool element of looking at it again, right? And yeah, having a little bit more of a ability to engage with some of some of what's going on in the language, even though I don't know Russian.
Well, so to make sort of a meta comment, like you invited in the beginning of the conversation, the introducer or the person who wrote the introduction for the Oxford Cambridge edition makes the claim that, like Shakespeare is something of the national poet for the English language and Goethe for the German, that
Hmm.
Pushkin is perceived even by or especially by Russians as the Russian national writer. And like you said, the Horace quote is "Oh Rus." So this like very even simplistic word in this very ornate and often long-winded Latin language is so simple. But he's constantly drawing attention, like you said, to what the limitations of the language are in literary parlance at that time, and romance, right, is a very much a literary endeavor. One thinks to the courtly elements of it, or the courtly origins of it, where letters were actually shared between people, and again, Tale of Genji, even in the East, and
Hmm.
from Murasaki's Shikibu, Genji, even when passing letters with his lovers, makes fun of those who fail at calligraphy, who don't do well at that. And so to have a limited vocabulary for expressing love, for expressing oneself, is actually a problem, but a problem that gets explored and I think and remedied by generating letters and love letters, and again, this is the time of the epistolary novel, and we do have letters in this. And so we see Pushkin like a to make a long point long, as some of my more vulgar friends would say, to pass the pillars of Hercules and not come back, as I might say. Um, uh, it's good to read, or I appreciate reading writers who help to form the literary language and the literary landscape, like a Goethe, like a Shakespeare, like a Dante, of course, with the Italian language. Those who find the words, and then he's immediately bolstered by Boccaccio and Petrarch, who help to really explore the literary limitations. And again, Petrarch, love, with Laura.
Hmm.
And so love, really the song of the human comes out with the pen. There are minstrels, there are troubadours, and there is a connection between that, but it can be sung or it can be written, and there's also a connection between writing that which can be sung. There's of course, music that's written. Music is often written. Um, and so I appreciate that he's do so not only but he's doing double duty too, right? To speak to his genius, he's not only writing a novel, he's writing a poem. So he's like Dante again, and doing very much like Dante, giving the richness of poetry and the artistry of poetry to the Russian language, and giving a great poem of long length to the Russian language, while also expressing one of the formative contents, or one of the contents that creates the vocabulary of love, of romance, of one of the more artistic modes of expression, that the way that like the men speak and woo to the women in a social context.
Yeah, well, it's weird because he's not really doing a lot of wooing though. It's also like it's self-conscious in that way too, because he's almost like by the time we meet him, although he's still very young, he's like very jaded, by
Yeah,
society, by
yeah.
pleasure.
but
And
he
he's like
does.
savagely spurning Tatiana at first, right? In the first half of the
Yeah,
story.
at first, but he does feel for her, but he just doesn't want what she has to offer, the domestic tranquility. I
Yeah.
mean, it's very close to home for me. I am, of course, happily married now, but having been once in my early mid 20s, I remember very distinctly having that feeling of somehow thinking that being in some sort of long-term committed relationship would inhibit me from my goals
Yeah,
uh,
right.
at those times. And so the idea that he doesn't want to be locked down, you see the sort of social progressivism of the generation after him, or in Dostoevsky, expressed in what seems like, though of course the duel, less pugilistic, or like hi, the stakes don't seem as high as in
Hmm.
Dostoevsky, where there's a murder or there's a big social upheaval and serfs over. Like this guy just seems kind of like a disaffected, sort of decadent dandy. Maybe this is what the generation before the major consequences come looks like.
Hmm. Yeah, I love the kind of contrast with Linsky in this regard, right? Like Linsky is more of a fiery, poetic, sentimental kind of character. Um, and he absolutely is like wooing, like he's so deep into Olga, the
Yes,
sister of Tatiana.
yes,
And you know, so much so that yeah, he precipitates this kind of awful duel based on, his friend, his close friend, like whispering something in her ear while they danced in in a house party, essentially like a ball, right? And it was like this one moment, and he just like couldn't abide it. But also because I think um, Onegin is like so again disinterested, right? He appears to be so aloof from exactly those feelings that are so precious to Lenski, the kind of conventional poet, And so there's this kind of like, is it an insult to his beloved Olga? Is it an insult to him? Like, why is he dueling his best friend? It's unclear. Is it because it's just the conventional thing to do? Like, this is what a young person in love would do, right? If he was truly in love, he would not allow any such a slight to his beloved. Um, and there's this other character who's introduced, like his second, right? Who's just like a terrible, violent guy, right? Like just loves like fighting basically, and so kind of like pushes him, eggs him on, and um, and so yeah, the responsibility for that moment, I think, is really interesting. Like it's partly the individuals involved, it's partly the society around them, right? It's just like that's again a very noteworthy change that has happened, at least in our perception of high society, I guess. Like people don't fight duels anymore, like they did back in the day, or at least they do in books. So I wasn't around, but like the yeah, the complicated nature of love when it's in such a society, such a refined and yet, maybe not that refined society, right? Like they're always sort of like self-conscious about their relationship to European ways of doing things and such. But anyway, it's quite it's quite complex, and so as the poem, as you're saying, like develops language. It's doing it through this incredibly deep theme, this like timeless theme of love, but it's doing it in this particular artful way of self-reflection, of almost self-parody at times, right? By putting this Lenski character in there, he's kind of ridiculous, and having this lover Onegin who's like an anti-lover in a way, he's like above love, he's beyond love, or he thinks he is, or he presents himself that way. Um, yeah, it's really it's something. Um, so we see like also these places, at least in Nabokov's translation, to just like complicate it further. There's all these places where there's like sort of broken off lines and broken off stanzas and just blank stanzas. Like he'll just leave out a bunch, but he'll number them, so you know that something's been cut or something that was intended to go in wasn't finished or something. Like I didn't read enough of his commentary to understand exactly what's going on there, but there's quite a few of them, right? This is in some ways a I mean it's perfect, it's finished, it's the classic, and yet it's not as filled out. It's not as long, I guess you could say, just to put it baldly, like as Pushkin might have intended at some point to make it. And he kind of signs off at the very end, being like, "Yeah, I'm not gonna write anymore about this guy." Like as much as it is kind of abrupt, and as much as it could be filled out more, it seems like he opted not to for some reason. And again, I'm sure there's more of a story there, but I'm not really aware of the whole ins and outs of that.
Hmm.
That's the edition you have, right? The Oxford
Yes.
translation you're looking at, right?
Yes.
Um,
Though I do not have the physical edition with me here right now, I do have the EPUB edition
mhm.
in front of me at this particular moment. But yes, I do have that physical edition. Well, I think this has been a good start to talking about um our new friend Pushkin. And maybe if we have one more session on this, and I will have a chance to get Babcock back in. But just so the listeners know, he's actually part of a bigger project that we're doing with Justin as well, which involves reading Brothers Karamazov, which we're slated to do September 20 something, 2 weeks or
So
so,
a couple weeks out, yeah.
couple weeks out. And so Babcock's saving his time to do the big project right now in large part. And Wes and I are just keeping it fresh uh between the uh between the sessions. Um, you know, we're the regular custodians. They come in for the special occasions. Uh, um, but yeah, I thought I appreciate talking to you today, Wes. I think next time when we have a full recap, I'll be able to share some more developed insights. I may also look into this poem a little bit too. But how much? So you mentioned the just one last thing. You mentioned the commentary on this, and so that's was something I was keen to observe. I was when Babcock told us that this was like Pale Fire, or that it was in some way modeled on this. And Pale Fire is such a scholar's book with all these footnotes and these two or three very definitive ways of reading it. I expected that to be the case here. And I have
Mm.
played around with form and read the whole book and then read it over again and then read individual chapters. Um, but I haven't seen where. So, are there a bunch of notes? And
Mhm.
so okay, and are they written by Pushkin himself or by the commentator?
So there's notes from Pushkin. Those are included at the end. And then there's a note about those notes that points us towards, I think it's maybe in another volume. I'm not really sure. Um, but apparently Nabokov has a whole, yeah, I think it's a whole volume of commentary on the poem. And he makes bracketed notes within Pushkin's notes about his own notes to the notes. Um, yeah, so there's a major you know literature on this text, and one big contributor to it is Nabokov himself.
Yes, well, I think next time I will be a little bit more informed regarding all of that, and I'll have a little bit more to say. But tonight was a good hit, whoa, Thursday night hitting session in terms of tennis, as it
Oh
were.
yeah, yeah.
And we missed Babcock, but hopefully he listens in. Hopefully he misses they didn't get to answer that awesome question that I had for him. And also, I'd like to draw some attention to the fact that I think you're dropping a new Video Game Academy episode soon with Professor Kozlowski. If you recorded it, I know technology might have really been a boggart there, but also I should say to these listeners, they may be a different demographic from the listeners who listen to this sort of thing, or maybe people listen to a bunch of all of us. I don't know. You can let us know in the comments. Again, we'd love to know.
Mhm.
But we're starting a new project. We just finished up Final Fantasy VIII after doing Final Fantasy VII. I should say at the beginning of all of this, I thought it would be really amazing if we did 7 and 8. And we did. And so we've already achieved, I think, my like biggest goals, except for keeping Vince around, which he's very much like Vince from Final Fantasy VII in that way. Or Shadow in Final Fantasy VI. And he's just tough to keep around. But now we're going to be pursuing or a new project playing Final Fantasy IX. And there were some huge contenders, Chrono Trigger. I really want to play Xenogears, but Wes has played Xenogears. Final Fantasy Tactics had a strong showing. Final Fantasy X had a strong argument for it. To Chrono Cross had a strong argument with me, probably not with Wes. And there were other like sort of dark horses that we didn't even really make it into the discussion, but were in the back of my mind, like Vagrant Story. Like and but Final Fantasy IX won, and it makes to us the most sense. I will admit that I have a much weaker emotional connection to it than to 7 and 8. But like Wes experienced with going back through 8 this last time, I'm very much open to getting a richer experience this time. And I know a lot of people really love Final Fantasy IX, and in particular love Vivi and like its particular flavor of teaching us about the nature of mortality and existence, even in fantasy worlds. And I'm looking forward to exploring that while continuing to look for the heart of modernism alongside Wes and often Babcock and often / sometimes Justin.
Yeah, I know. For myself, yeah, nine was a game that I played as probably once or twice, but don't remember very well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to replaying it here. Yeah.
Yes, and since we're playing it so soon after 8, we can have some continuity of questions like representation and antagonists and their feminization, for example.
Oh yeah,
Sephiroth,
right, Kuja.
Kuja is like even more fem Sephiroth. In any case, I'll save this for the first discussion that we get to then, but that's a nice preview for people of or of our other sort of content. And well, Wes, I can tell that it's night there, even though it's earlier in the night there. Good night, sir. And I'm looking forward to podcasting with you in just a couple days on Final Fantasy IX.
Sounds good. Take care.